Well, he had a choice to become a Cubs fan or a Cardinal fan, and he chose wrong. He became a Cubs fan. George Will has gone on to win a Pulitzer Prize and write a number of books. His newest book is called A Nice Little Place on the North Side. George Will, welcome back to St. Louis and the Big 550 KTRS.
Glad to be with you.
Go back to that day. People do not believe it when you tell them how you became a Cubs fan as opposed to a Cardinal fan.
Well, I grew up in Champaign, Illinois, midway between Chicago and St. Louis. All my friends became Cardinal fans and grew up cheerful and liberal, and I became a gloomy conservative, used to losing.
Is it really because Harry Carey was then the voice of the Cardinals?
Well, Harry Carey and the Griezedick Brothers Baseball Network, you guys are too young to remember all this, but Griezedick Brothers was beer, and beer is you may know, is a big part of the book I've written, saying beer was important to the growth of the country and the world, and particularly baseball. But Harry Carey just rubbed me the wrong way. But for the same reason, I suppose that people loved him all the way out in Texas and Oklahoma and Arkansas and Mississippi, because he was such a homer for the St. Louis Cardinals. And I got my back up and became a Cub fan, and I've been punished for it ever since.
A nice little place on the north side. Wrigley Field is 100 years old, and the Cubs didn't move in. It wasn't built for the Cubs.
No, it was built for the Federal League team. They were called the Chicago Whales. Now, why a team 1,000 miles from saltwater would be called the Whales, I do not know, but everything about Wrigley Field's a little bit strange. The Cubs moved in 16. The glory years of the Cubs were 6, 7, 8, 9. They were the Yankees for a while. But as you know, the Cubs haven't won the World Series since 1908, which is 2 years before Mark Twain died and before Ronald Reagan was born. So it's been too long, frankly.
You can have a bad century every once in a while, can't you?
Well, we're on the second century of our rebuilding effort, and that's too long.
What are your thoughts as the Ricketts family? Now, you're not known as a traditionalist per se. You're much more of a modern guy, if you will, if I can put a label on you. The Ricketts want to put $500 million and redo Wrigley Field. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, Wrigley Field is really old, older than the Empire State Building, the Supreme Court Building, the Lincoln and Jefferson Memorials, Mount Rushmore, the Golden Gate Bridge. When you're a 100-years-old structure, you're old, and there are big chunks of concrete falling down in Wrigley Field, so it takes some maintenance, and the Ricketts are determined to keep the ballpark, which they know is important to the identity of the franchise. So the money has to be spent. The real argument in Wrigley Field is about whether or not they should have a modern Jumbotron scoreboard, and if it can be small enough, large enough to do its function, but small enough not to overshadow the scale of the ballpark. Part of the charm of which is it's shoehorned into an organic living neighborhood in a city, the way ballparks used to be, like Crosley Field, Forbes Field, Ebbets Field. So that's a delicate match they're trying to strike, and I think the Ricketts family is doing it well.
What about the argument that the rooftop restaurants and bars are going to lose their view into the stadium because of all the signage they're going to put
Well,
up?
now, isn't that just too bad? They're stealing the Cubs' product. I mean, I hate to make this obvious point, but the Cubs spend all this money, they train and put a team on the field, and these people across the street make a lot of money with very valuable properties, peering over the fence into the ballpark. I don't bleed for those guys, frankly.
I agree with you. George Will, our guest, his new book is A Nice Little Place on the North Side. You write in the book, George Will, Wrigley Field at 100. Your point is brilliant, and it is you go into a museum to see the Mona Lisa. You don't go into a museum to see the museum, but that's exactly what you do with Wrigley Field. You go to a game to see the museum.
You're right. I mean, there's a lot about baseball in here. No one would care about Wrigley Field if it weren't for the ballpark club, but the club hasn't been very good. I mean, I write about Ruth's called shot and all the rest that happened there, or didn't happen in that case, in my judgment. But when William Wrigley, after whom the field is named, died, his son, P.K. Wrigley, inherited it. He really didn't want it. He wasn't that interested in baseball, and the Cubs weren't very good in the 40s and 50s, and he said, team's terrible, the ballpark's great, let's sell the ballpark. He said the ivy will be so lush and the grass so green and the sun so warm and the beer so cold, no one will care about the scoreboard. Who's winning? At one point, P.K. Wrigley even asked the Cubs announcers to quit referring to Wrigley Field and to call it instead Cubs Park, because people like going to a park. Well, I'm sorry, that's not the way you run an efficient franchise. I mean, right now, the best-run franchise in baseball, I generally agree, is the St. Louis Cardinals. And you got a great ballpark, but you're not selling the ballpark.
Mm-hmm.
You're selling a quality product.
It's a really interesting part. And you know what's, I mean, Wrigley's had sort of a renaissance. You mentioned the 40s, the 50s. In the 70s and the 60s, that area around Wrigley Field was kind of dangerous to go to.
It was, and Wrigleyville, as the neighborhood is called, has made a great comeback. You know, when the Giants decided to build the replacement for Candlestick Park down in the China Basin section on the water in San Francisco, they emulated the Wrigleyville experience. They put their ballpark on a very small 13-acre footprint. It's not surrounded by acres of asphalt for parking. They said people will find a way to get to the ballpark, and look at them. They sell out every night without serious parking available there. And the neighborhood is vibrant with restaurants and bars and all the rest, and again, it's just as Wrigley Field sells the baseball experience, so does the Giants ballpark. You know, about 98% of self-described NFL football fans have never been to an NFL game. They're made fans and sustained as fans on television. Baseball fans are made by and sustained by going to the ballpark, the communal tribal experience. And we've all seen it in St. Louis, that sea of red of coming together as a community for 3 hours. It's a magical experience.
George Will, our guest, his book is A Nice Little Place on the North Side. He writes about Wrigley Field and everything about it, 100 years in the making. George Will, what happens if the Cubs ever do win the World Series? What's going to – I mean, they're going to lose their lovable loser moniker.
Yeah, well, look, the Red Sox hadn't won since 1918. They win in 2003. I don't see whenever it was they won. Yeah, I guess it was that. Anyway, I don't see a whole lot of Red Sox fans jumping off the gravy train. They're perfectly happy to be with winners. They say losing's good for your character. I've got quite enough character, thank you. I want to be spoiled by the decadence of winning.
When the Cubs play the Washington Nationals, are you a bit of a National fan these days?
I'm a season ticket holder, and I have a handicapped son works in their clubhouse, and I root for the Nationals until the Cubs come to town. And then I root for the Cubs.
And then you root for the Cubs. And what about the president's race at those national games? Do you like that?
I do. I root for William Howard Taft.
Wait a minute. Here's a guy, you complained about dot races and helmet thing, and you like the president's race in the Nationals ballpark?
Well, I don't want a president's race, and I don't want sausage races in Wrigley Field, but the Nationals got it, so I had to pick a president, and I picked William Howard Taft.
There you go.
The most conservative of the lot.
There you go. George Will, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, Cubs fan, and author as well as a big baseball fan. The book is A Nice Little Place on the North Side. George Will, thank you for your time. Thank you for your entertainment, and we'll talk to you down the road.
Thanks a lot. Good to be with you.
You got it. Check that, 8:30 here on the Big 550 KTR.